How can I tell my spouse is cheating on me? If somebody has an affair, does that mean that the marriage is over? How long is the divorce process going to take? How much is a divorce going to cost? Shouldn't it be 50-50? What leads to divorce? Is your marriage doomed? Hi, welcome to Divorce Decoded with Bolton Law. This is Ruby Bolton. I'm the founding attorney for the Bolton Law Firm. And on this podcast, we try to demystify the divorce process. And we explore what can go wrong with a divorce and what you can do to keep that from happening. So if you tuned into our last episode, I had a fabulous guest, and you're probably wondering, I wonder who Ruby's going to have this time. So let me just explain a little about the formatting. We are going to be releasing every 2 weeks. And my thought is that every other episode, I will have a guest. I know some amazing people who have a whole lot to bring to the table. And on the alternating episodes, what I want to do is address the questions that people have that are most troubling to them, and maybe delve into some of the complexities of our divorce law and see what I can answer for you. So today, what I wanted to do is talk to you about the questions that my team hears the most often. So what I did is I went through my office and I asked all the different members of my team, the attorneys, the paralegals, intake team, client relations, what are the questions that you hear the most often? What is it that people want to know? And I'm going to do my very best today. I've got about 45 of them, and we've got about 30 minutes. So we're going to see if I can cover 45 questions in 30 minutes. Buckle up. So the very first thing I want to talk to you about is your marriage doomed? And by that, I mean, people say to me all the time, well, 50% of marriages end in divorce. I am sure that you have heard that statistic. That is not true, at least anymore. There was a time when we were very close to that 50% mark. But these days, it's actually closer to 60. The chances of a marriage being successful have been increasing steadily over the last 15 years. And there's a lot of things that you can do to help ensure that your marriage helps those statistics to improve if that's what you're interested in doing. And we'll talk about that at a later episode. So the next question that I get from people a lot is my marriage really over? Is this the time to file for divorce? And I'm going to tell you first that I am never going to make that decision for anybody. I think that you are the only person who has the ability to decide that. You're the one who knows how happy or unhappy your marriage is or what's going on in it. I used to tell people all the time that there are 3 people that really know what's going on in a marriage, and that is the 2 people in it and God. And I can tell you that in my first marriage, turns out there were only 2 people, and I was the odd man out. So I'm not going to tell you, is it right for you to file or not? And no attorney should ever tell you that. But what I can tell you is, does your story sound similar to other people? So let's talk about when you should file. So one of the questions that I get a lot is, how can I tell my spouse is cheating on me? So, and y'all have to forgive me here. I am a very animated speaker. It's very natural for me to move around when I talk. Too many years of making oral arguments to judges and jury, but it's really bad when you're trying to talk into a microphone. So I'm going to work on improving that, and please tolerate me while I learn this lesson. But how can you tell if your spouse is cheating on you? So the first guideline I'm going to give you to that is that people always assume that other people are exactly like them. And what I mean by that is somebody who would never cheat on their spouse tends to never think their spouse is cheating on them, even when the signs can be pretty obvious. And someone who cheats is constantly worried that their spouse is cheating. So I would actually say the first tell that your spouse might be unfaithful is when they suddenly start getting jealous and possessive of you and start questioning what you're doing. Why are you talking to that person? Who's that email to? Not always, but that can certainly be an indication. So the second thing that I tell people is trust your instincts. And by that, I mean, if you have never before thought that your spouse was cheating, it has never occurred to you, it's never been a worry, and suddenly you can't quite shake it, there's probably a reason for that. And that's something that you might want to explore and sit down and talk with your spouse, or maybe even examine, why am I suddenly feeling like this? So I would say the next really big tell is, how private is your partner being with their telephone? And not everybody's the same. There are some people that are super private and they never want anybody to look at anything, that, it's just how they are and they've always been that way. And then there are some people that are super open. I will tell you, my children know the password to my phone. My boyfriend, actually, he doesn't because he's never asked, but my husband definitely knew the password to my telephone. It's just, I tend to be pretty open. But if your spouse has previously been open and suddenly they're not, that's a pretty good indication right there. So the next question that people ask is, if somebody has an affair, does that mean that the marriage is over? And I'll bet I'm going to surprise you here, but most people do not get divorced as a result of an affair. And let me clarify that. What I mean by that is, most marriages will survive one affair. Just statistically speaking, I would say, in fact, I remember looking at this before, but it's something like 2/3, a little over 65% of spouses, if there is an affair, one incident, it's going to cause some problems. It might, eventually that marriage might end, but in most cases, if it's never happened before, if it is dealt with openly, honestly, the chances are pretty good that your marriage can survive it. So the next question that I get asked a whole lot by people is, what leads to divorce? Well, the first one we already talked about a little, which is infidelity. And I will absolutely say, yes, infidelity does lead to a lot of divorces. Now, most of the time, it's not the first time. I'm not going to say it's never the first time. I've definitely been involved in divorces where it was the first time. Sometimes the spouse was pretty sure they were, but finally they knew. And in that case, I don't really think that falls under the statistic of will an affair end a marriage. I can tell you that most people who are having an affair are incredibly believable when they deny it. So I have heard tape recordings of people when their spouse confronts them about having an affair. And in a lot of these cases, we find out absolutely they were later on, right? We take the deposition of the girlfriend or boyfriend, or somebody's pregnant. I mean, there's just absolutely undeniable proof. And yet, those tape recordings, which people do tend to make, wow, they sound so believable when they deny that affair. So what ends marriages? Absolutely, infidelity is up there. I would say, though, that it's not number one. I think finances probably is the number one thing that I hear. And just to be clear, when I say finances, that covers a whole gamut of stuff, right? So it might cover, for instance, one spouse who is extremely controlling and will not involve the other spouse in any financial decisions. I've seen marriages end because one spouse was really spendthrift and could not walk past a clothing store without buying 2, 3, or 4 things. I've seen marriages end because somebody ran up $100,000 in credit card debt and then the spouse took out from their retirement, paid it off, and they solemnly swore it would never happen again. And then guess what? It's happening again. So there are those kind of financial problems. Also going into that, I would say like job loss, or sometimes a lot of money coming in. So I have seen quite a few divorces that began because a spouse either had just made a lot of money or they're about to make a lot of money. And they think, do I really want to have to share this? So you've got infidelity, you have got money issues. I think that the number 3 thing that I would say is actually shared workload. And by shared workload, what do I mean? We have in our society a tradition that the woman ends up doing the majority of the care at home and that the man earns the majority of the money. But the reality in today's world is that most women are working as well. And yet statistics are going to tell you that they continue to handle the majority of the household chores and the child rearing. And from what I see, that is a very significant reason. I have seen a lot of divorces from both sides where an unwillingness to share that burden was ultimately what led to the breakup of the marriage. So I would think that the number 4th thing that I would say is just people changing over time. And by that, I mean you can get somebody that is very, very, say, religious, right? And they enter the marriage and they feel the same way. And then as time goes on, one of the spouses no longer feels that way. I see, or people call it growing apart, right? Where somebody was very focused on family and they're raising their children together and everything's about the family, and then somebody becomes extremely focused on their career, or they just seem to no longer be interested in those things. And this is where people tell us, well, we just drifted apart, or maybe there was a very bad temper and one spouse, or maybe people once had a good temperament and went haywire. But I've also seen the other way, where 2 people get married and they both have really bad tempers, and one person is like, I'm done with this. I'm not willing to do this anymore. I need to change. So that actually brings us to a few other reasons that I see people getting divorced. I'm surprised I neglected this earlier, but substance abuse. I would say substance abuse is very high on the list of why I see people come in to seek divorce, because their spouse has an issue with alcohol is actually the number 1 culprit. I will tell you right now, you have a lot of people worried about marijuana and is marijuana legal or not legal. I remember 20 years ago talking to a Republican judge in Harris County, just at some dinner or something. And he kind of told me privately, he said, I know that marijuana is illegal and I should really care about that, but I've never known anybody to get stoned and go home and beat up their wife. And what that judge told me is that he found much more serious what people did when they were under the influence of alcohol. So I would say the next common reason that I see people getting divorced is mental health. And unfortunately, we live in a society where people are really ashamed of having mental health issues. And sometimes that shame causes them not to reach out and seek help. And I see mental health challenges as the impetus behind a lot of people when they come in for divorce. So the next thing that I want to address is who files for divorce. I had somebody ask me, actually, I was at a open house last night, I think, and somebody said, well, isn't it just women that file for divorce? Don't women file for like 75% of the divorces? Well, first off, it's not 75%, but I will say absolutely women file for divorce more often than men. But I don't think that that provides a very full picture. And let me tell you why. That is because women care a whole lot more about that title, matching reality. So women file more, but I have seen cases where their husband is expecting his second child with his girlfriend, and they haven't lived together in, 4 years. And the wife finally comes and says, I can't handle this anymore. I cannot be married to somebody who is not married to me. Well, she's the one who filed for divorce, but is she really the one who left that marriage? So I'll tell you, it's probably closer to 60-40. But even being said at 60% of the divorce filings are by women, I'm going to say women are probably responsible for more than 60% of them. And this is why. The situation I told you where they've separated, they both lead their own lives, they're dating. The husband, in so many cases, is totally content to not worry about the fact that he's legally married. And he's just going to live his life, do what he wants. And it does not bother him that back in the courthouse, there's a document that says he's married to somebody. And then he gets a girlfriend. And suddenly somebody cares. And it's not either of the spouses. It's the new girlfriend. She cares. She doesn't want to be with somebody who's legally married to somebody else. So, yes, I think one way or the other, women are probably responsible for almost 75% of the filings. But I think probably closer to between 55 and 60% are they the ones actually wanting out of the marriage. They might be the reason it's being filed, but they weren't the one that wanted out to begin with. So another question that I get a lot is, if I ask for if I ask for a prenup, is that going to doom my marriage? Absolutely not. So I will tell you that people are way more likely to ask for a prenup on a second marriage than they are on a first marriage. And a second marriage statistically has a much higher possibility of resulting in divorce. And so any statistic that you can pull about the likelihood of getting divorced because a prenup exists, it's probably being skewed more by the fact that there's a prior marriage in most of those cases where there's a prenup. So I'm going to tell you that every marriage is going to end at some point. Sometimes it ends through divorce and sometimes it ends through death. But at some point that marriage is going to end. And a prenup is designed to say when the couple is getting along, let's set up some of the terms for how this is going to look at the other end. So is a prenup a good idea? Well, we'll go into more depth on that on another case. But I've got to tell you, if you've got children from a prior marriage, I think a prenup can be a really good idea, if only to make sure that you and your spouse are on the same page. So by far, the biggest question that my team told me that people ask them is, how much is a divorce going to cost? And I'll tell you, you can call around to, 50 law firms, and you're going to have a trouble getting a straight answer. And the reason is because we don't know. So I will tell you that I believe that the last statistic for the state of Texas was that the average divorce cost $18,600 before it was over. Now, most attorneys are not going to start out saying, I want $18,600. And of course, there's some that cost a lot more than that. They're going to start out with a smaller amount. We don't know how much your divorce is going to cost because we don't know how cooperative your spouse is going to be. So that brings up our next question, which is, what is the difference between a contested and an uncontested divorce? So I will tell you that an uncontested divorce, a truly uncontested divorce, is a lot like Sasquatch. You hear about them, you've seen evidence of them, but if you're in this business long enough, you do begin to wonder whether or not they're real. So when an attorney talks about an uncontested divorce, we don't mean both parties agree that they want to get divorced. So some of the most bitter, contested, contentious divorces out there, both of the parties can't wait for the divorce. That doesn't make it uncontested. When an attorney talks about an uncontested divorce, we literally mean you tell us what you want and we write it up and they sign on the dotted line like a good little girl or boy, and they don't ask us any questions. They don't argue about anything. You're going to tell us on day one what you want to write up. We're going to write it up and they're going to sign. And how often does that happen? Well, that's why I mentioned Sasquatch. Even for people that walk in on day one and say, we've got an agreement and here it is, when you really delve in and start writing it up and thinking about it, there's often a lot of other things that need to be worked out. So the next question that I got is, don't women always end up with the children? And I will tell you, I had team members that told me they get this a lot from men and that they sound very, very defeated. So I want to tell you there's a short answer and a long answer to this question. The number one thing you need to know is that according to Texas law, the gender of the parents, it is illegal to consider it in any way in making a determination about custody. I have actually been in court and objected to somebody talking about, the bond between, a mother and no, you can't say anything to try to give the judge or the jury the impression that because this person is a female, that they ought to get the kids, or because this person is a male that, therefore they wouldn't be a nurturing parent. So the good news is that the law is very squarely on your side. And that if you are a man wanting custody, and it doesn't make any difference at all. Now, the bad news is that I think our judges are very good people, and they really are trying to do what they absolutely think is the best thing to do. But no matter how conscientiously they work at making the decisions based solely on the case that's standing in front of them, they're all human beings. They've got their own, not only their own lived experiences and what was the situation in the family that they grew up in? What's the situation in their current family? What have they been exposed to? There's also what do they see in court again and again and again. So in the United States, 80% of children that live with just one parent live with mom. So you might think that your chances of getting custody are 20%, but that's not true. Most of the time, the children end up living with mom because both parents agree that that's the best place for them. In cases where it's actually contested and dad strongly feels that the children ought to be with him, you get a much more even split. So the next thing is, I will tell you that I love representing men seeking custody. And in fact, most people who have a lot of experience with family law like that too. And that's primarily because most of the time when a man seeks custody, it's because he's really very, very committed to that child. And because it's rare, right? And we really like representing parents that truly and sincerely care about their child. So the next question is, you've probably heard about 50-50 possession. And shouldn't it be 50-50, like the child spends 50% of their time with mom and 50% of their time with dad? And I will tell you the answer to that in the state of Texas is no. We're going to assume that the child should live with one parent most of the time and that the other parent has frequent visitation periods. Now, if you're not most likely going to be the person that the child lives with, you should know that it's actually about 59-41 split of time, and that you will be given a whole lot of time with that child. As I said, approximately 41% of the nights in a year that child is going to spend in your home. So when you hear about, for instance, when you read about shared custody agreement, Texas standard possession order counts as a shared custody provision. So why isn't 50-50 the default? Well, I will tell you that statistically, most of the time when parties agree on a 50-50 custody split, they go less than 6 months before one of the parents is voluntarily giving up time to the other parent. Most children don't like it. It is very confusing. Consistency is extremely important for children. A lot of people hear that I'm not a fan of 50-50, and they assume that that must mean I'm anti-dad. No, absolutely not. Remember what I told you before about 80% of children that live with one parent live with mom? When you push 50-50 as the default, what you're getting is you're creating a world where when mom wins, she gets custody. And when dad wins, he gets 50-50. Well, I think that if the father's been the primary parent, if the father is the one more closely bonded with the child, I don't want him getting 50-50. I want him to get custody. So the next question that we get a lot is, well, if we do a 50-50 possession, that means there's no child support, right? So no, it doesn't mean that. There's nothing in the code that says that. There is no way in the code to calculate what happens with child support when you do a 50-50. We do kind of have traditions in family law that people have done for a long time, enough so that it almost approaches the rule of law. And that is, well, we'll calculate what mom would pay dad if mom were to pay child support. And then we'll calculate what dad would pay mom if dad were to pay child support. And then whoever pays more, they just are going to pay the difference between those two amounts. And that is what I see the most often when you have a 50-50 parenting split. So the next question that I get is, how can I get supervised visitation? So I will tell you it takes a lot to get supervised visitation. It's not enough to say that, well, this person has never changed a diaper. Well, the court's going to assume they can learn. Everybody has been in a position where they've never changed a diaper. You've got to show, in most cases, that there is a chance of legitimate harm. So the next question that I get a whole lot is, can I move back to wherever I came from? So most of the time, what I see is a parent, they're getting divorced and they're going to be keeping the children, usually by the agreement of both parents. And they're worried about how they're going to hold down a job and be a parent all by themselves. And they think, I really need to move next to my family for support. So I will tell you first off that the presumption in Texas is that we want to keep people close together. So most of the time, if somebody asks for a geographic restriction, a specific area in which they want the child to live to allow visitation, the court is going to grant that. Now, there are cases where they won't, but there's a pretty strong presumption and a leaning that it's best for everybody if we have a geographic restriction. So how do you calculate child support? Every state does this differently. I will tell you in Texas, we're going to calculate child support based on one thing, and that is the income of the obligor, or the person who's going to pay child support. So There are other factors that we can throw in there, but most of the time, for one child, you're going to get 20% of after-tax income, and for each child after that, it's an additional 5%. So 2 children, 25%, 3 children, 30%, 4 children, 35%. It can't ever go over 50%, no matter how many children you are. Now, there are other factors. If you've got a special needs child, the court's certainly authorized to consider the needs of the child in deviating from that. The most important thing to know is that there's kind of a cap. Now, it's not a cap on what the court's allowed to order, but it's a cap at which we're no longer going to assume that this 20%, 25%, 30% is in the best interest. And that cap is at $9,200 per month of after-tax income, or about $150,000 a year. So once you reach that, you're at the maximum amount that the court is going to automatically assume ought to be applied for child support. So who's going to insure the children? Most of the time, the children are going to be insured at the cost of the person paying child support. So the judge is required to order that the children have health insurance. If you qualify for Medicaid, then a parent is ordered to do Medicaid. If you can get it through an employer, it will be ordered that they get it through an employer. If there is no employer, the court is going to put an order in there that somebody go out and purchase the health insurance. That's something that the legislature feel really strongly about. So the next question we get is, how does the court decide how to split up property? Is Texas a 50-50 division state? So what the code says is a fair and equitable division. Is 50-50 a fair and equitable division? Well, I've had judges that feel pretty strongly that that's exactly what that means, and you're going to have to really prove to them if you want something else. But I think most of our judges are more willing to accept that fair and equal or fair and equitable doesn't necessarily mean exactly 50-50. There is a list of other factors that the court is able to take into consideration. The number one that I see is the income of the parties. You might think, okay, well, I've earned more of the money, so that means I get more of the stuff. But the court actually tends to go in the other direction. If you have one spouse that out-earns the other, the spouse that earns less tends to be awarded more. So the next most common factor that we see is the children. The spouse that is getting the children is more likely to get more of the community estate. Now, keep in mind, and I think it's important to know this, when we say it's not necessarily 50-50, I think it's pretty rare for a court to go above 60-40. So that's pretty much the entirety of your play, between 50-50 and 60-40 in the very most extreme cases. So next, does Texas have alimony? Well, yes, but we don't call it alimony. We call it spousal support. I will tell you that Texas is very, very stingy when it comes to spousal support. And if you compare it to just about any other state, you're going to come off worse in the state of Texas than you are there. In the vast majority of cases, nobody is going to qualify to receive alimony at all. And when you do, it's going to be a limited amount for a limited amount of time. So how about separate property? Well, we've talked about that before, but the biggest exceptions to community property, the rule is if either party owns it and you're getting divorced, we're going to assume that the court can divide it and that it belongs to the marriage. The biggest exceptions to that are, did you own it before you got married? Or was it a gift? Or was it an inheritance? The other one is pain and suffering from personal injury lawsuit. Now, there are other exceptions beyond that, but I would say probably 98% of separate property comes under one of those. Everything else, the court is going to consider community property. So that's subject to being divided. Not necessarily 50-50, but in a fair and equitable manner. So one of the big questions we get is, how long is the divorce process going to take? And this is another question that you ask a ton of law firms, you're going to get a ton of different answers. I can tell you legally it can't take less than 60 days. If the two of you don't come to an agreement at some point during that process, it's much more likely that it will be a year. Now, the good news is most people will come to an agreement at some point, either because it becomes obvious what's going to happen, or the parties go to mediation and they come to an agreement at mediation. I think the average length of filing for a divorce in Texas is 8 months. And remember, that includes people that are getting divorced really quickly, meaning 61 days. There are a few of them out there, but it also includes some people who have very complex property divisions or other factors, and you could be looking at a year and a half before it's over. Also depends a whole lot on where you go. So next, can you just mediate your divorce? Well, you're almost certainly going to. You may not or may not settle your divorce at mediation, but you almost definitely are going to go to mediation. And that is because almost every court in Texas is going to require that you try to settle your case at mediation before you are allowed to have a final trial. So I have people call up sometimes and they just want to hire a mediator and neither side has an attorney. I will tell you, we don't see that done very often. And that is because the mediator feels very uncomfortable giving legal advice, letting people know what they're entitled to, what they're not entitled to. But we can very definitely take steps to get you to that mediation table earlier. And one of the things that we can do is to help that mediation to be successful, make sure that we've got all the documentation that's required. So if you go to mediation, usually you're in one room with your attorney, your spouse is in another room with their attorney, and the mediator goes back and forth to try to reach an agreement between the sides. And I would say that that is overwhelmingly the most common way that divorces are settled at the end of the day, not just in the state of Texas, but all over the country. So if you go to mediation and you've got that mediated settlement agreement or MSA, you might think, hey, I'm about done with my divorce. We're at the finish line. There's actually still a lot of time involved. We've got to turn it into an order. You're usually looking at a bare minimum of a month between when that MSA is signed and when it's entered. Sometimes we can hurry the process a little. Sometimes it takes a lot longer. So what if you don't settle at mediation? Well, then you're actually going to have a final trial. So we can agree sometimes, we can speed up. Everybody can agree we're going to let this particular person be an arbitrator or a private judge, and we can set exactly when we're going to be heard, and we can do it earlier. Otherwise, you're kind of at the mercy of a court. It can be pushed back quite a number of times. So when you go to trial, yes, you're going to be on the witness stand. The other side will be on the witness stand. And we ask questions. Some people really look forward to that. They feel like it's a vindication, like things are airing out. Most people do not like it. And that's why we are going to take any steps that we can to try to settle your case. So I will tell you, I know that there are a lot more questions out there. I don't think I got close to my 45. I need to definitely work on wrapping it up and doing it faster. But what I'd really like to do is address your questions. So if you have a question, please leave it in a comment below and we will address it. Once a month, we are going to be answering questions that are put on here, and we're going to collect them from social media as well as our team members and other divorce attorneys. I'd really like to make this time as effective as possible in answering the questions that you really want to hear the answer to. So I'm looking forward to hearing from you. I sure hope you're looking forward to hearing from me. We'll talk in another 2 weeks.